Okay. So, dear friends, let's start because we're already a bit late and we have a very distinguished and with a large number of speakers panel. So, dear friends, on behalf of the Permanent Mission of Greece and the Greek National Commission for Human Rights, which is in person, embodied here next to me, I am very pleased to welcome you to today's event, Integrating Human Rights Considerations into Corporate Governance Frameworks, Advancing Human Rights Due Diligence in Global Supply Chains. I think for implementation of all our principles and priorities in human rights, this is one of the most important practical things we have to do, integrating them into our daily business cycle. This event is co-sponsored by the Council of Europe, and thank you very much for that. In today's highly interconnected global economy, supply chains extend across multiple jurisdictions and involve many different actors. Ensuring that business activities respect human rights throughout these value chains is therefore both a challenge and an important responsibility. Today's discussion will explore how human rights due diligence can strengthen corporate governance, help prevent adverse human rights impacts, and support more sustainable and responsible business practices. We are very pleased to have with us a distinguished panel of speakers, as I said, from international organizations, policy institutions, academia, and the business community, who will share their perspectives and practical experiences. So, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the Vice Chair of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Professor Robert McCorquodale, who is joining us online to share his reflections on the work of the Working Group and in particular on its upcoming report on corporate governance and human rights. So, Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I am delighted that you have invited me, and particularly the excellent Maria Gavronelli, that you are looking at this issue, which is a keen issue of great interest to the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, which, as you know, is a group of 5 experts under special procedures with a mandate to implement the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And at this moment, we're in the process of writing a report to go to the UN General Assembly in October on corporate governance and business and human rights. And this is part of the concern that the Working Group has had for many time about the need for good corporate governance by boards and by senior executives in order to drive respect for human rights into the organization's culture, business model, and strategy, and in its everyday decision-making. What this report is examining is how, if at all, the UN Guiding Principles have been and should be applied in relation to corporate governance through consideration of the state's duties to prevent human rights abuses, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and access to effective remedies. Its particular focus will be on directors' duties and on the responsibilities of senior executive governance of large businesses. And those large businesses, of course, have an impact significantly on small and medium-sized enterprises. We have a call for inputs about it, which I'll put in the chat box, and we will happily accept late written submissions, as long as it's within the next month. And please do contact me if you have particular experience as a senior manager or as a board director of one of these large listed companies, because very much the work that you are discussing, the ideas behind good corporate governance in relation to human rights are key issues for the longer term implementation and application of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Unfortunately, I cannot stay very long, but I do appreciate this possibility of an intervention. And I wish you a great lot of discussion on this point. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. And now, without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Maria Gavronelli, Chair of the Greek National Commission for Human Rights.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you for all your hard work organizing that. Robert, it's always a pleasure to see old friends and actually finding ourselves working again in this very, very important work encompassing business and human rights. The Greek National Commission for Human Rights is actually the Greek National Human Rights Institution. As you know, national human rights institutions serve as a bridge between the state on the one hand and civil society on the other. And civil society is not just associations and NGOs or whatnot. Civil society is especially the private sector, industry, corporations, businesses, all those people who are working tirelessly and provide the wherewithal that would keep our societies alive and well. We realized fairly on that we needed to have the industry, we needed to have corporations, we needed to have businesses on board. And the idea was to activate a pincer movement, if you like. You would have enforcement of human rights from the state, but you would also need to have the coordination and the cooperation and the contribution of the private sector in preventing abuses, but also in making absolutely certain that they can contribute in the effective implementation of all the protective measures required. And that's why we reached out to the industry, CRS Hellas, next to me, my colleague Alexandra Pali, whom I would like to thank so much, and also Global Compact Greece, Mrs. Sophie Mithilineou will join us in a while. But between themselves, they have actually a wide array of Greek companies, and Greek companies operating in the country and out of the country. And why is that important? Because on the one hand, they help us create the proper environment for this effective implementation of human rights and the actual protection of people involved. But working outside of the country, they also carry along in their luggage, so to speak, best practices, all their ideas and suggestions, the legislative framework, but not only that, their everyday type of working, the way they do business. And that has an impact in local communities, and that has an impact beyond the boundaries of Greece. That is the reason we believe that that was very much our role, enhancing this kind of cooperation so that we can end up with this joint effort in the implementation of human rights throughout the value chain. We would continue working on that. Our companies would contribute to the report prepared for the General Assembly. So, Robert, you are going to receive all kinds of things coming in. And we would continue working with the authorities and, of course, the Greek state and other states, our colleagues at the Council of Europe, to that end. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Professor Gavouneli. During the discussion, I'd be interested to hear how you are actually going to measure the results. I mean, what data is involved? But yeah.
Perhaps I can address that right away. What we realized when we started talking about this kind of situation was that people really did not know what was this all about. So what we have done, first and foremost, was mapping the scene, if you like. So we invited all the players in a major conference in Athens, which was also an awareness-raising exercise. So come along and tell us what you have been doing. But by the way, perhaps now you can find out what others are thinking about that. And we identified particular areas of concern, for instance, trade unions. The trade unions had absolutely no idea that labor rights were involved in this kind of process. So we produced a major report. That report is now made public, and it's going to be updated regularly. And that report would serve as a basis, as the standard against which we're going to measure any possible change. The idea being that if the data involved in employment, for instance, or best practices or areas of environmental concern or things like that need to change in 2 or 3 or 5 years, the impact of EU directives might kick in or whatever, then we would have actually a baseline against which we can measure whether things are going up, down, sideways, whichever way they're going. Thank you.
Thanks again. And now our next speaker is Mr. Livio Sarandrea, UNDP Global Policy Advisor on Business and Human Rights, who will share with us the perspectives and work of the UNDP. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for the kind invitation. I will share today three main observations taken indeed from the experience of UNDP, which is in the BHR space, mostly focusing on the field work. My first observation is that since the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or broadly speaking, responsible business conduct, the discourse has progressed steadily and has shown, in the largest part, to resist, if I may use this expression, to at least two major potentially existential crises, pragmatic and practical one. The first is the COVID-19. Many of us were worried that in the moment in which the economy was hit hard, companies would start by deprioritizing responsible business practices in a moment very difficult for them. We have seen that even though it was a very difficult moment for all of us, including for the economies, the responsible business discourse, if you like, survived that very difficult moment. Similarly, and that's my second example, we have seen in the last 2 or 3 years some pushback by certain actors on the might of some of those policies on responsible business conduct, including the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. There was indeed an intense discussion over the last at least 2 years on the level of the ambition of this directive, and there were even talks about removing the directive altogether. Well, even though the result of this discussion was a diluted corporate sustainability due diligence directive, the mandatory directive remains, and the EU still have a mandatory human rights due diligence, which I think is a positive signal. Equally relevant for me has been witnessing during my latest mission in Asia, validating, trying to understand whether there had been an impact of the anxieties in this part of the world over Asia, over the Asia, which is of course also in large part supply chain and value chain of European companies. Well, my understanding, having visited in the last month Japan, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia, and through the work that we do in other countries in Asia, my understanding is that the discourse in Asia is actually very strong, was not affected by the anxieties in Europe. It is perhaps even stronger than ever. And though the responsible business conduct discourse in Asia started as taking inspiration from what is happening in the EU, now Asia is continuing very rapidly. And the examples that make me optimistic is the current discussions in Thailand, in Indonesia, in South Korea, and to an extent in Japan about introducing mandatory human rights due diligence. My second point, if I may, it's around conflict, or in fact more specifically on the responsibility of conflict, of companies in conflict-affected context. I'm sure I don't need to convince anyone in this room of how current the issue is. My view is that companies obviously have an enormous impact of companies, and they can spark conflict, they can exacerbate conflict, or indeed they can be peace engine. My reflection is that against an obvious moment of heightened crisis around the world, the awareness and even more the ability of companies to be peace engine and not actually negatively impacting conflict is still quite low. So the encouragement that I bring to these conversations today is to seize all opportunities to spread more awareness among companies of their impacts on conflict through the exercise of what technically is called heightened human rights due diligence, which is a combination of human rights due diligence and conflict sensitivity. It's a little bit of a technical issue. I mean, obviously, there's not time today to go into a lot of details, but I should flag that UNDP and the Working Group on Business and Human Rights have come up with a guide on heightened human rights due diligence, which, again, I would encourage all interested in this subject to take a look at. My last point is about the opportunity ahead of us to gather additional buy-in from corporate actors, including at the board's level, at the CEO level, if we include in this conversation the aspect of the ability of responsible business approaches to be conducive to operations which are more resilient, more stable, more resistant to operational, reputational, and legal risk. I'm referring to what is simplified as a message around the business case for human rights. And let me be crystal clear on this. Companies need to respect human rights and labor rights whether or not there is a business case for it. But as we gather more and more evidence, even empiric evidence that being responsible is also good for profit, I think it's important for all of us to connect those two elements even more. In this case, again, I have a reading to suggest to you. It's a study which we launched a few weeks ago at the Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights, which is called Human Rights versus Competitiveness, a false dilemma, which empirically presents data. We talked earlier about data that compare human rights performance of companies and their financial performance, showing that human rights and competitiveness are not at odds with each other. Let me stop here. Obviously, I'd be happy to go into any more detail on any of these issues during the Q&A. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thanks so much for that, and I'm glad you finished on that note. There is no incompatibility between human rights and competitiveness in business. Also, the fact that you mentioned the European Due Diligence Directive, which will be analyzed by one of our speakers to come, I think that's one of the most important developments. I hope other countries with large internal markets also do this. And I do have a question on that. How do you interact with governments to make sure that, let's say, your recommendation on business in conflict-affected areas, how they integrate this into national legislation?
Well, thank you for the question. UNDP is not a standard setter, but did in this specific area of work, did some work with the Working Group on Business and Human Rights on unpacking the practice of, again, what I called earlier, heightened human rights due diligence. This includes some recommendations for the states, right? As recommendations, of course, for the companies on how to interact in conflict, but also recommendations for states on how to set policy and expectations on how they want their companies to operate. And in practice, as far as UNDP is concerned, this translates into the work that we do with many countries around the world. When they draft their national action plans on business and human rights, we support many of these processes around the world. We advocate for a chapter of these NAPs to include provisions on the expectations that companies include conflict sensitivity in their human rights due diligence efforts when they operate in crisis context. The same would apply, of course, to those countries which we are supporting to draft actual legislation on mandated human rights due diligence. And there's a number of countries, again, that already include these provisions. Thank you.
Now, I have the pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Geetha Roerlens, head of the Multinational Enterprise and Responsible Business Conduct Unit at the International Labour Organization, who will speak about the relationship between human rights due diligence and labor standards in global supply chains.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to first thank His Excellency Ambassador Gikas for also inviting the ILO to speak in this very important exchange. Thank you very much for this. And I will indeed speak also about the ILO's role and, of course, the role of international labor standards when it comes to due diligence in supply chains. Because as you all know, when we speak about human rights in business operations, many of these human rights have been made further explicit in international labor standards that have been negotiated and adopted by governments, employers, and workers in the International Labour Organization. And within that body of international labor standards, the ILO core labor standards, as they are formulated in the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, are particularly relevant when we speak about due diligence in global supply chains. These fundamental principles and rights at work are specifically mentioned in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, Pillar 2, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, but they are also included in many trade and investment agreements, in corporate codes, in sectoral initiatives, in many other private sector initiatives. So they are really a very important basis when it comes to the corporate responsibilities, when it comes to human rights in business operations. The ILO's own instrument on responsible business conduct, the Tripartite Declaration of Principles Concerning Multinational Enterprises and Social Policy, the M&E Declaration, also contributes to further promoting the uptake and realization of these fundamental principles and rights at work, but it takes a broader approach to the business contribution to decent work more broadly. And when it comes specifically to supply chains, as ILO, as you know, we support governments, employers, and workers on realizing the protection and respect of labor rights in business operations, including in supply chains. And in the ILO, we adopted a specific strategy on decent work in supply chains that really aims to advance decent work in supply chains, including by strengthening the legal and policy framework in member states. And I think we should not forget that. That is a very important component also of the state duty to protect. And that includes ratification of ILO conventions and their effective application in law and practice. And we see that there is still a long way to go to make this a reality. But the strategy also promotes responsible business conduct based on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the M&E Declaration, including when it comes to due diligence, also enhancing access to remedy for workers, access to broader labor justice, also collecting data, we already talked about it, collecting data on what actually works to advance decent work in supply chains, taking into account different legal environments, different legal contexts in which companies operate, and also strengthen partnerships with many other international organizations that work on this topic. And I'm pleased to see that a number of us are indeed here together on this podium. Specifically on human rights due diligence, as ILO, we manage a number of programs in, I would say, all regions of the world to support companies in conducting due diligence, and conducting due diligence with the objective of improving the respect of labor rights in their business operations. And at a global level, we actually operate the ILO Help Desk for Business that specifically supports companies that come to the ILO and seek guidance on how to incorporate principles of international labor standards in their operations. And we see more and more companies actually coming to the ILO in the context of due diligence processes. Because either when they have questions on how to conduct due diligence in a meaningful way when it concerns labor rights, and then specifically how do you engage in a meaningful way with workers and their representative organizations, or because when they conduct due diligence, they have actually identified specific salient human rights risks, which are actually risks in the area of labor, and then what it is that they can actually do about it, either through their own practices or through collective action, because many of these issues are actually broader development issues. And just think about elimination of child labor, or you think about a number of other areas. There are limitations to what one individual company can do, because they are broader development issues. So through collective action, this is very important. And we are also expanding actually our support to companies in the context of an EU-funded project that we have on human rights due diligence in support of decent work, where we will make more ILO data available for companies that are actually conducting due diligence, so that they have better information on what is actually happening at the country level when it concerns the protection and respect of labor rights. We are very pleased to see that there are actually many ongoing processes and initiatives when it comes to the respect and the protection and the respect of labor rights in global supply chains, whether it is through legislative initiatives or other support programs that many governments are taking, but that also are being taken by multi-stakeholder initiatives and others, because it clearly demonstrates that there is a collective commitment to this important agenda. And many questions actually have to be asked, because the questions are really about where is the evidence that we see in terms of what is working and why is it working in a certain context? What are the kind of leverage points that we can further build on to make sustained progress in several areas? What can governments learn from each other? What can companies learn from each other? And how can all of that actually inform more collective action in this area? And before I finish, I just want to highlight that actually in the ILO's governing body that will start in 2 weeks' time, we have a very important paper that is on the agenda on possible initiatives that complement the body of international standards to ensure decent work in supply chains. It will be a tripartite discussion, so between governments, employers, and workers, and I will focus on various options that the ILO could undertake based on its mandate, tripartite approach, and expertise to address decent work deficits in supply chains. And I think it's very relevant in this context. And these options were developed on the basis of a mapping and a gap analysis that the ILO conducted on the impact and effectiveness of global, regional, and national regulatory and non-regulatory initiatives. It recognizes clearly the distinct and complementary roles of government and businesses in this area, and emphasize also the mutually reinforcing elements of normative and non-normative, of private and public, and mandatory and voluntary, international and national. And I'm sure when I say these words, you will very much be reminded of the smart mix of measures that was already highlighted by John Ruggie when he actually introduced this element of a smart mix of measures in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So as ILO, we clearly have a very strong mandate also in this area, and we very much look forward to working, of course, with our member states, but also with the other international organizations to keep moving forward on this agenda and come to a much broader protection and respect for human rights and labor rights in supply chains. Thank you.
Thanks for that. Just to ask, so you have actually individual companies that come to ILO, and what is their motivation in that?
So we have indeed quite a number of individual companies that come to the ILO. They come in various forms to the ILO. First of all, they are, of course, represented in employers' organizations that participate in the policy setting and the setting of international labor standards in the ILO. but also they come on an individual basis. So the one-stop shop, if I may say, for the ILO, for companies coming to the ILO is the ILO Help Desk for Business. And the reason why they come to the ILO for guidance is, of course, because our labor standards are international labor standards. And when they have operations in many different jurisdictions, in many different national legal contexts, they want to uphold international standards. So they actually come to the ILO to align their policies with these international standards that they then commit to in operating across the different jurisdictions. Because that is a big challenge for companies. They operate in many different legal environments, and still there is an expectation to uphold these human rights that are codified in, of course, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the covenants, and then in ILO standards. So how do you do this as a company? So that is why they come to the ILO, but also they come to the ILO for sharing of experience. We run a number of business networks in the ILO on child labor, forced labor, non-discrimination. And we see these are really the topics that companies are struggling with, precisely because of the different legal systems in the countries where they have operations, but also because a number of these topics, as I mentioned, are broader development issues that one company cannot solve on their own. And so they are looking also how through this work together with the governments, with social partners, with other stakeholders, they can actually contribute to addressing a number of the root causes. Because if not, they will continue to be confronted with a number of these challenges. And we know in the current economy, with more and more informal economy progressing, there are bigger risks actually to human rights violations in business operations. And the further you go down into the supply chains, the more companies are actually confronted with these as well.
And you don't have some sort of accreditation system for companies that actually do come to you and comply with all these standards?
We don't do any kind of certification or accreditation, as you call it. That is not in the remit of what the ILO does. There are indeed quite a number of companies that ask us for, whether it is possible. We do run programs such as the Better Work program, for example, in garments, but it's not called certification. It is actually doing assessments of how suppliers of large brands, how are they complying with national law and upholding international standards. But we then accompany actually those companies in making progress where the weak points are in the companies, but it's not an ILO certification scheme. No.
Thank you so much. So now I give the floor to, I would like to invite Ms. Katarina Nedilkovic, advisor to the Director General of Human Rights and Rule of Law of the Council of Europe. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. First of all, let me begin by welcoming you all and also by thanking the Ambassador and also the Greek mission for this kind invitation extended to the Council of Europe to participate in this event on an important subject in which the Council of Europe has been increasingly involved. Well, first of all, I would like perhaps to highlight that the Council of Europe is the regional organization. It's not the global organization like the representative that we have here, ILO or UNDP. And this is the organization which has three core missions. The first being human rights, second being rule of law, and third being democracy. So thank you again for the invitation, because Greek and democracy, it goes a long way. So the Council of Europe achieved those three core missions through standard setting, through monitoring of implementation and cooperation between its member states. It has 46 member states with 700 populations enjoying the protection of the European Convention of Human Rights and many more businesses. And I hope you would agree with me that Europe being one of the most developed markets, this is certainly a fact that should be taken into account in any corporate strategy, because 700 million consumer is certainly the double size of the United States market, for instance, just to give you an idea of the comparison. So the rights guaranteed by, first of all, the European Convention of Human Rights are practical and effective according to the famous dictum of the European Court of Human Rights. They should not be theoretical and illusory. Now the question is, and you might ask the question why the Council of Europe should be present in this forum when we discuss about the due diligence. Well, first of all, when we discuss about the corporate due diligence, I would like to say that the Council of Europe treaty system, first of all, European Convention of Human Rights, but also European Social Charter, they provide a substantial and binding foundation. I highlight the word binding because those are not optional norms that you can apply or not apply. So they are binding on the territory of all, under the jurisdiction of all 46 member states. And they lay down the foundation for responsible and right-based business. This is a living framework. This is an ongoing process. And the Council of Europe is also investing much efforts to develop further its treaty system in response to emerging challenges. For instance, one of the emerging challenges, which is relevant also for the corporate environment, is certainly use of artificial intelligence or climate change. Now, I was very happy to hear from the previous speakers about their work on this topic, and in particular on the report mentioned by the UNDP colleague. I would like to say that the Council of Europe has become increasingly involved in the business and human rights areas since last year. And in particular, last year in October, we were happy to present the Council of Europe report, which I brought here. And this is report, Human Rights and Competitiveness. Reframing the business case for human rights. This is a report which is publicly available on the website of the Council of Europe. It was prepared by Professor Nicola Bonucci and Geneva-based Professor Polly Bowman. And I'm very happy also to see that all the reports, UNDP reports, in our report, they came to the same conclusions using a different set of data, different set of information. The Council of Europe report was based on a desk research, on interviews with corporate professionals, on public data, and on case studies. And the key conclusion of the Council of Europe report is that the smart businesses are human rights compliant businesses. The report actually look into the view that human rights compliance by businesses is actually an economic burden or economic liability, that it is just a cost side of the story. And that in fact, human rights compliance is a threat to the European competitiveness, especially when you look into the competitors and the market, let's say from the Asian markets. The report came to the conclusion that the human rights compliance by businesses is not just a moral obligation or a legal obligation in Europe, but it's also a strategic business decision, because human rights compliance can deliver concrete and measurable benefits, assets to companies. And as the report said, the investment in human rights is not a cost. It is an investment yielding tangible and intangible benefits for companies, increasing their competitiveness. Both are practical results of the human rights compliance in corporate setting. First of all, human rights compliant companies, they experience fewer legal disputes. They enjoy greater resilience throughout global supply chains. They maintain the trust of investors and employees, and they are better prepared for reputational risk and sudden market shocks. The human rights compliant companies are also attractive employers. so they are able to retain talent easier. They foster renovation and adapt better to crisis. Now, those conclusions from the Council of Europe report from October last year also largely aligns with the prevailing economic thought. And I would just mention at this point that in 2024, the United States professor Darin Acemoglu received the Nobel Prize Award in Economics for his work demonstrating that strong institutions are the key enabling environment for thriving businesses. So the question is, what are the strong institutions? The strong institution is equal to the rule of law, because the healthy markets are built on right-based foundations. Now, the companies which are not complying with human rights, in the long term, they can experience cost of non-compliance, like fines, lost contracts, legal actions, or reputational damage. So the cost of inaction on human rights by companies can be existential for them. So the final, my conclusion, I would like to say that the human rights compliance is certainly enable of success or performance and resilience. Strong human rights practices are ticket also to innovation and to trust and to sustainable competitiveness. Council of Europe will continue to work in this field and to increase its presence. And in particular, I would like to say that the last October, the Council of Europe organized its first Business and Human Rights Forum. We will also continue working on different issues, starting from artificial intelligence, social rights, and on many other aspects on which we are present. I would like also to indicate that our relevance is not only limited to the European scope. Certainly, European Convention on Human Rights is mandatory for the member states of the Council of Europe, and it is not applying beyond the member states of the Council of Europe. However, we do have many instruments which are relevant also in the non-European context, and in particular, I would like to mention the first ever International Convention on Artificial Intelligence and Human Rights, Rule of Law and Democracy, which now has increasing membership. And for instance, we have the first country from Latin America which joined the convention, which is Uruguay. We have also a lot of interest from African countries, etc. So those are the standards which will become a golden standard in their field, and which are certainly important for companies. And lastly, I would like to say that being in an intergovernmental organization in the Council of Europe, we did not work so far, we have not worked so far much with the companies, but we want to change this, and we had many companies in attendance in our first forum, and we would like to invite more, and also to start working with them on raising awareness on the relevant standards developed by the Council of Europe. Thank you very much for your attention.
For your intervention. Now I'd like to give the floor to Ms. Sofia Mytilineou Daskalaki, President of the UN Global Compact Network Greece, who is also joining us online.
Hello, can you see me?
Yes, yes.
And you hear me? Hello, good afternoon from Athens. I thank the ambassador as well as Mrs. Gavunelli for the invitation. I am delighted to speak today as a chairwoman of the UN Global Compact Network Greece in this discussion on how we can better integrate and advance human rights due diligence. Over the past 25 years, the UN Global Compact has been working with the private sector around the shared global vision, a movement of businesses and shareholders partnering to create the world we all want. The UN Global Compact is a dynamic organization that brings together the sustainability efforts of companies, regardless of size or sector, and stakeholders across the world through its country networks, including, of course, the Greek network. We're talking about a principle-based approach to sustainability. Our 10 principles derived from the UN declarations provide a universal language when addressing human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption issues that are deeply interconnected. Six of these principles relate directly to universal human rights and labor standards. So human rights are truly central to our corporate sustainability agenda. Through our work at the UN Global Compact Network Greece, we are seeing more Greek businesses embedding human rights into their core strategies. Many companies now have human rights policies in place, but only a few conduct comprehensive human rights impact assessments. And this is not only a Greek phenomenon. A recent benchmark by the World Benchmarking Alliance found that among 2,000 most influential companies worldwide, only 6% fully meet core human rights due diligence indicators. This means that more than 80% have yet to implement the fundamental steps of identifying, assessing, and addressing human rights risks. This disparity highlights both the urgency of the challenge and the opportunity of companies seeking to lead. For our participants, the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights provides the authoritative global framework on the policies and processes companies should implement to meet their responsibility to respect human rights. At the same time, the evolving European regulatory framework further reinforces these expectations and translates them into concrete obligations for companies operating in the European market. The UN Global Compact Greece is therefore ramping up its efforts to help Greek companies transform human rights commitments from policy to practice. Allow me to mention just a few examples of our work. We have trained more than 150 business executives on human rights and due diligence issues. Every year, companies participate in specialized educational programs on human rights due diligence in close cooperation with the Greek National Commission of Human Rights, a key partner in advancing business and human rights in Greece. We also provide practical tools and guidance on issues such as responsible supply chains, living wages, and sustainable procurement. And importantly, we create communities to participate where companies can exchange experiences and challenges with peers at national and European level. At the same time, we reinforce corporate accountability and transparency through the annual communication on progress submitted to the UN Global Compact platform. However, relying only on voluntary measures will not achieve the progress needed for business respect for human rights. The UN guiding principles themselves call for a smart mix of voluntary and mandatory national and international measures to foster corporate respect for human rights. We therefore need both effective regulation and proactive voluntary engagement. Data show that companies based in countries with human rights regulations score nearly 60% higher on average than those operating in countries without such frameworks. At the same time, voluntary engagements, such as participation in the UN Global Compact, can play an important role in preparing companies for upcoming legislation. This was also referred in our survey on the first CSRD reports of Greek companies, where the UN Global Compact is cited as one of the most recognized global voluntary frameworks in sustainability statements, reaffirming its role in helping companies meet growing expectations for transparency and accountability. Of course, compliance and reporting are essential. However, meaningful integration and leadership beyond compliance are equally important. With this in mind, let me briefly highlight 3 key points. First, respect for human rights is not only the right for doing the right thing, it is also a business issue. It affects the entire business ecosystem, workers, suppliers, and communities. Embedding human rights due diligence into corporate governance helps companies better manage risks and avoid significant operational, legal, and reputational costs. And here, permit me to say that managing risks is my favorite subject when talking about sustainability as regards with businesses, because businesses do understand the risk case. Second, regulatory frameworks, voluntary guidance, and collective stakeholder efforts are all necessary. Together, they help minimize negative impacts on people while also safeguarding fair and healthy competition. Third, whether we are talking about companies directly subject to regulatory requirements or SMEs participating in global value chains, practical guidance, tools, and capacity building are essential to enable effective implementation. Looking ahead, it is clear that businesses, as well as global, European, and local communities, cannot achieve sustainable progress without acting decisively on human rights. And no one can do it alone. Businesses must work together with governments, the UN, civil society, and academia. This realization becomes even more important in today's challenging global context. Now is the time for bold leadership and inclusive action. And now is the time to invest in a more just and equitable world. By embedding the universal ideals of the UN into business operations, companies can demonstrate that respect of human rights is not only a moral imperative, but also a prerequisite for long-term success and sustainability. I truly believe that we're all part of this effort together, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Mtelineo Daskalaki. I would add a comment to that. I think that business and human rights is also a political imperative for governments around the world. For governments in developed nations, it's a political imperative because it helps safeguard the rights of workers in their own countries, and it fights the growth of irresponsible populist political forces. And in the developing world, it's the only way to go forward with real economic growth and sustainable development. So it's a fundamental issue, and we all need to raise its political profile. So thanks for your comments in this regard. I now give the floor to Ms. Dimitra Serafimidi, business and human rights consultant and training lead, who will share her experience working with enterprises on the European Union's due diligence legal framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador and Ms. Gavunelli, for the kind invitation and the opportunity to contribute to this discussion, which is very current, given that we're seeing a growing expectation that companies integrate human rights into governance systems and internal processes as part of a common legal framework that creates legal certainty and evens the playing field. And here is where the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive comes into play as part of a broader regulatory shift, translating the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights into binding obligations. So we're working with a lot of businesses that will have to comply with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or else CS3D. So what does the CS3D does? It essentially requires companies that fall in scope to carry out due diligence in order to identify and address their actual and potential adverse impacts on the environment and human rights. And we're talking about impacts in their own operations, those of their subsidiaries, and those of their business partners in their value chains. So essentially, there is a shift in the focus of due diligence, because the traditional due diligence is about the risk to the company, whereas human rights due diligence is about the risk to the people. So companies under the CS3D are called to carry out human rights risk assessments in order to identify and assess their human rights risk and impacts, and subsequently adopt preventive or mitigation measures in order to prevent or cease, respectfully, those risks and impacts. And such measures, we see that they include investments or upgrades in facilities and infrastructure, contractual assurances from direct business partners that they will comply with the company's human rights policies and supplier codes of conduct, as well as improvements to the company's own business plan and model and procurement practices. Also, companies are required to provide remediation for the impacts they're causing or contributing to, as well as establish fair and accessible grievance mechanisms to allow rights holders to report their grievances and potential adverse impacts that they might have suffered. Lastly, under the CS3D, companies are obliged to track and report on the effectiveness of their due diligence efforts, because it's one thing to put a system and a process in place, and another to actually make sure it's effective. And very importantly, engage with relevant stakeholders across the due diligence process. Now, in terms of the transposition deadline, all EU members are required to transpose the directive by July 2028, and the measures will start applying from July 2029. And in a very practical sense, why does this matter for Greek businesses and all businesses for that matter? So companies will be affected by the directive either directly, if they fall under the scope, and currently the directive targets very large entities that generate more than 1.5 billion in net turnover, and they have more than 5,000 employees, or they will be affected indirectly as suppliers to these larger European companies that fall under the scope due to the trickle-down effect. Now, what does the trickle-down effect means is that small and medium enterprises that are in the supply chain of those larger Greek, not just Greek, but those larger companies, European exactly, will have to adopt similar human rights and environmental standards, because those larger companies need to be able to ensure and demonstrate that potential and actual impacts in their supply chain are promptly identified and addressed. So suppliers who are due diligence ready will remain competitive partners. And also we should say that a lot of companies are already have to comply with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, under which they are obliged to disclose on their adverse impacts and due diligence processes that have to do with sustainability matters, including human rights. Now, what are some of the steps that companies can take to implement human rights due diligence? First of all, establish human rights governance systems. This means that they should appoint a person or a department within the company who will be leading on and implementing the company's human rights strategy. And also, in this sense, consider whether establishing a human rights committee to support the coordination collaboration will be necessary. And most importantly, ensure that the board has the ultimate oversight and accountability for the company's human rights strategy. Second, companies should embed human rights into their enterprise risk management systems. This means that they do not need to reinvent the wheel. It's simply a matter of looking internally, see what processes they have to identify and manage the risk, and then see how they can integrate human rights into these processes. And then, of course, it's very important to adopt a shared responsibility approach and meaningfully engage with key stakeholders, including their business partners. And as a closing remark, I would like to say that the CS3D should not be viewed simply as a compliance exercise, and this is what we're also advising our clients, but as an opportunity for companies to strengthen their governance systems, build resilient operations and supply chain, and effectively remain competitive business partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And now I give the floor to Ms. Alexandra Pali, President of CSR Hellas. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but we're eager to share.
I'll try to be very quick. So, Your Excellency, Ambassador Gikas, dear Mrs. Gavunelli, Professor Gavunelli, thank you so much for being here, for the invitation. It's really an honor. I would just like to say a few words about our organization, CSR Hellas. We are the corporate social responsibility in Greece. It is a network founded 25 years ago by several enlightened CEOs, the Athens Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and the Hellenic Industrials Federation. We are now consisting of 166 Greek enterprises, all sharing the same values, being entities which support the CSR values, the 17 UN SDGs, sustainability, responsible entrepreneurship, and the ESG criteria, being as the strategy, governance, and administration of their entities. They are enterprises that operate to economic development and value creation and benefit society, and to benefit society at large. We have, as a network, developed and applied specialized tools and services. We implement initiatives and collective actions amongst our members, government institutions, and third parties. We create awareness and updates by being an active member of CSR Europe, situated in Brussels, and we are promoting collaborations between public and the private sector. Human rights. Both on the international and European level, there is a clear recognition that human rights are considered to be closely linked to business activity. They are part of the broader discussion on corporate governance, on transparency and corruption, on business relationships, on value chains, and on the conditions under which economic activity is considered responsible and legitimate. The question is no longer whether standards and frameworks exist. The question is whether those standards can be implemented in a credible, consistent, and operationally meaningful way. In 2025, the CSR Hellas network and UNICEF Greece launched a collaboration intended to support a more structured understanding of children's rights in the business context through dialogue, capacity building, and the implementation of standards, as well as measurable performance indicators. Within the framework, the results of a public survey were presented on how businesses in Greece understand and integrate children's rights into their operations and business relations. The first point that emerged was that awareness appears to be advancing while implementation still remains fragmented and partial. A second point was that the weaknesses identified were practical in nature and demanded for a change in corporate culture. They concerned management, executive and employee training, supplier audits, grievance mechanisms, and environmental risk assessment. Due diligence depends on whether an enterprise has the processes, the internal attention, and the organizational capacity required to identify risks, assess impacts, respond appropriately, and review the effectiveness of its actions. The discussion that followed from these findings highlighted the importance of moving beyond narrow issue framing, strengthening governance attention, and fostering a more practical culture of implementation. In that respect, the Greek experience proved useful, not only as a piece of research, but as a basis for a more structured exchange on what implementation actually requires in practice. human rights due diligence performs a preventive function when it is treated as part of ordinary business practice. It can make risks more visible, improve the quality of internal decision-making, create earlier opportunities to prevent or reduce adverse impacts. It should not be understood only as a matter of formal compliance. It speaks to the reliability and integrity of business ethical conduct. The Greek experience brought into focus a further issue, the gap that may exist between the internal corporate perception and the external social expectation. This illustrates that the public trusts depends not on declared commitment alone, but on whether that commitment is supported by visible practice and measurable results. When analyzing the results, we have to take into consideration that the Greek economy consists of 98% of medium and small enterprises. This means that progress in due diligence requires proportionality, practical guidance, and forms of support capable of enabling smaller businesses to develop more structured approaches over time. In CSR-LS, we are SME-oriented, even though our members are the larger companies in Greece, because smaller companies, SMEs, they don't lack willingness. They lack awareness, they lack structured guidance, they lack practical tools, human and financial means, and the internal capacity required to translate expectations into practice. And that is why collaboration with largest organizations and enterprises is very important, so that a common language emerges, a baseline is established, and gaps are more visible, therefore they can be measured, and we need training, we need guidance, and we need integration. Cooperation matters, SDG 17, progress, which is more likely when businesses, international organizations, and the academia, like everybody said, work together in order to create evidence, to share understanding and tools that can be actually be measurable in practice. In January 2026, CSR-LS and the Greek National Commission of Human Rights, we signed a memorandum of cooperation which intended to support the integration of human rights into business practice and to strengthen dialogue and capacity building in this area. It is a modest, yet a very meaningful indication that the implementation agenda is beginning to acquire a more stable institutional base at a time where competitiveness itself can no longer be separated from transparency, accountability, and the management of social risks across the value chain. From the Greek experience, I can refer to three conclusions. First, due diligence becomes more meaningful when it is connected to identifiable business. Second, evidence matters. Without some form of a baseline assessment, businesses cannot fully appreciate either their level of preparedness or the areas in which implementation still remains very weak. Thirdly, effective implementation depends not only on standards, but also on translation, on the ability to convert principles into processes, expectations into practice, broad commitments into forms of government that can operate in ordinary business settings. The Greek experience may be limited in scale, however, it's very useful in substance. It shows that progress becomes more credible when discussion becomes concrete, when assumptions are tested against evidence, and when cooperation helps build practical capacity rather than merely general awareness. I will give you three examples of our members. For example, Titan Cement Company has launched a due diligence method to evaluate risks and dangers of human rights in Greece and abroad, based on the UN directions. They also employ an ethics point platform, which enhances open communication and transparency, and comply with strict terms of the CS3D directive. Another member, Cosmote, the Deutsche Telekom Group, they employ a human rights code, which commits employees, suppliers, and third partners, and is based again on the international platforms such as the UN, the ILO, and the OECD. It also employs an HR due diligence for human rights and environmental issues and a supplier code of conduct that commits suppliers to comply with an environmental and social issues. This implementation dimension deserves to remain at the center of the business and human rights discussion. Closing, I would like to say that I'm confident that today's 61st session of the Human Rights Council will have a very positive impact. Again, thank you very much for having us, and we promise that we will be by your side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a shame we didn't have more time to hear more fully. Now I give the floor to our last but not least speaker, who is also our informal mentor at the Representation for Human Rights in Business, Ms. Agni Mendaki Tripodi, Business and Human Rights Expert at the UNDP Global Policy Roster and Lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the invitation. So I'll try to be very quick. I wanted to showcase challenges and opportunities that businesses and states face in their effort to promote responsible business conduct in global supply chains by presenting an actual insights from a human rights impact assessment from the fishery supply chain. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a UNDP project that was focusing on implementing UN guiding principles in Tunisia in the fishery supply chain. Next slide, please. So my work there was to identify human rights issues in the supply chain and work with businesses and the government to find out the challenges, but also overcome opportunities and complexities. All right, so this is the fishery supply chain, just to see that this is how complex it is. Identified issues, so I will stay probably only to that slide and the next one. Issues on labor exploitation, gender dimension, illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. But here I wanted to emphasize more the benefits. For sure, there are the short-term benefits of stopping human rights violations, right? For example, migrant workers' abuses, or women's inequality, etc. But here I wanted to show also more mid-term and longer-term benefits for the societies and the economies, right? So sustainable fair compensation, poverty reduction, sustainable economic growth, all these super tightly related with sustainable development goals. Next slide, please. And the last one. Some more issues, for example, livelihoods on coastal communities, environmental pollution, marine resources and environmental issues. How, by respecting human rights in the supply chain, would lead to long-term benefits for the societies and the economies, apart from the short-term human rights, prevention of human rights violations. And thank you for your time. I need to stop here. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks again. We'll put the slides up on the media. So thanks again. Thank you, and apologies to everybody who has been waiting. And thanks to my team.